Good morning. Welcome to Torah for Women's video series, The Yeast of Unleavened Bread. I'm Judith Garten. Now this video is number 2 in our series, and I want to take a moment to invite you to subscribe and turn on all notifications so that you don't miss a single episode. I'm hoping to record number 3, 4, 5 very soon. We have a lot to discuss today. Today I want to give you a little matzah for thought. If someone plans to abide by the 18-minute rule of baking unleavened bread for Pesach, Passover, they must also, and I'm going to be blunt, follow all of the rules which are set in place to guard that 18-minute rule. Wait, what? What is an 18-minute rule? Well, if you've watched our hands-on video where I make unleavened bread, I do mention it quickly, but let's go over it. The 18-minute rule is rabbinic. It is a rule written by man, and that rule written by man guards the creation of matzah that is certified kosher for Passover. I can bet by now there's some sisters out there saying, wait, I thought there was just one rule, and that it was that the bread, or the matzah, the flat bread, needed to be mixed and baked within 18 minutes. Isn't that the only rule? What other rules are there? Well, there are a number of them, to be honest, and if you have decided you must follow this one rabbinic rule about 18 minutes, you should be aware of all the other rules which apply. Let's start at the beginning by explaining, very simply, what rabbis state matzah is. Matzah is a crisp, flat, unleavened bread made of flour and water, but must be baked before the dough has had the time to rise. It is the only type of bread which Jews may eat during Passover. It must be made specifically for Passover use under rabbinical supervision. Very direct, very blunt. That is from an article called What is Matzah? Kosher for Passover by Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz. Now, interestingly enough, there's more detail here I will go over in other videos. But the basic ingredients of unleavened bread are so simple. There's 3: flour, water, and salt. Now, often people leave out the salt, which makes only 2: flour and water. So what are the other rules? Well, first, let's understand that there are 2 types of matzah that are manufactured. Modern technology has made it so that they can mass produce. But the first thing that has to happen is every one of the machines, floors, walls, and ceilings must be certified kosher by the rabbi. That means a rabbi, a man who is a leader in Judaism, must come into the plant and certify that it is kosher for Passover. The machines have to be cleaned of all past flour, possible dough, ingredients, whatever, cleaned. So then, from there, they will no longer be making the simple, regular matzah, which is available throughout the year. They will be making shmura. That is shmura matzah. What is shmura? It is the matzah that is created and then supervised or guarded, because the word shmura is the Hebrew word for guarded. It is guarded by the rabbis from the time the wheat is harvested, so they use a special wheat, to the point where it is ground, and after it is ground, made into dough and baked. Now, from the point of harvest to grinding, it must not come in contact with any water. However, are you aware of the fact that actually wheat, it has a basic moisture content? Generally speaking, from my experience, you want it below 15%. Good quality wheat that is stored for longer term needs to be right around 10 or 12%. I have in the past bought wheat with as high a moisture content as 20%. I use that right away. I don't store it. Now, as I've mentioned in some of my other videos on biblical prepping and in the video on the unleavened bread that I make, I've been making breads for over 30 years. and I studied wheat and the different types of wheat during the early part of that. So I've actually learned more about wheat than I ever thought humanly possible to know. Am I an expert? No, but I am knowledgeable in that topic. And I share that with you because we need to understand that there is already moisture present. You can grind that flour and actually release a small amount of moisture already into your dough. That's not taken into consideration. So it is there. Where you live, depending on the humidity you live by, guess what? You have moisture that will touch the contents of that bowl. These are things that are not taken into consideration. Moisture is just there. It exists, just like yeast exists in the air. But the rabbis ensure and certify that no moisture has come in contact with that grain. There are some rabbis that will suggest that you can make your matzah at home, and all you need to do is take the grains, the kernels of wheat that you can purchase that are certified kosher for Passover, and then you take those grains and have them ground or grind them yourself. Then you are responsible for ensuring they have not come in contact with any moisture. After the flour is ground, then you add the water. Why are they so protective of the wheat and the water? Because their belief is that fermentation, or the activation of yeast, happens within 18 minutes. I am here to tell you, and I will leave links in the comments below, or in the description below, that explain to you that is not the case. There have been studies done that demonstrate that depending upon where you live and the types of yeast that are present in your air, yeast can activate in as little as 5 minutes. And it can take as long as well over 18 minutes before it activates with that water being added. Now, I've lived in a number of different places. I've lived in Ohio, Arizona, New Jersey, New York, and West Virginia. The most I've ever made bread was in New York, New Jersey, and in West Virginia. Now, in New Jersey, I lived at 20 feet above sea level, give or take a few feet here or there. New York, it was much higher. However, in West Virginia, we live above 3,000 feet. So it's a dramatic difference of location, location, location. Interestingly enough, in New York, where I lived outside of Syracuse, and in southern New Jersey, the yeast activates about the same amount of time. So if I'm going to make a sourdough or a sourdough starter, it activates, starts functioning and eating whatever's in the sugars and the starches that are in the wheat that is ground into flour. In that flour, the minute you add the water, in New Jersey and New York, it won't start to bubble for a few days. So if I'm making the sourdough starter and feeding it every day, it may take a few days before bubbles start to form. I have had, here in West Virginia, within 2 hours. That's the shortest amount of time. The longest amount of time that it took bubbles to form in my sourdough starter mixture, the longest it took was 8 hours, not days. Now granted, sourdough starter gets better over time as you feed it. However, I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that in West Virginia, that yeast starts to feed very soon after I add the water, because for it to actually develop the bubbles in the goo, it takes time for them to show up. But that means the gas, the fermentation, is already happening almost immediately, within a few moments. I will never make the 18-minute rule, ever, in West Virginia. So the rabbis chose an 18-minute time period to give people a standard, but it's not 100% accurate. Now, as far as the matzah certified kosher for Passover, it needs to be made quickly. So in other words, you need to mix that dough. You need to divide it, roll it out, and bake it fast. It has to be done fast because according to them, it has to be in the baking process at 18 minutes. But did you know that you need to bake it at an extremely high temperature? Most rabbis recommend 600 to 800 degrees. Does your oven even go that high? Mine doesn't. Mine goes only as high as 550 degrees. on the oven setting. However, if I tried to bake my matzah in the cleaning setting, I could hit 900 because it will hit 900 degrees. There won't be any matzah left, but we would have ash. This is why I said you're going to need to be aware of all of the rules. The dough also needs to remain in a constant state of motion. As I demonstrated in my video, my dough doesn't stay in a constant state of motion. After I'm done kneading it, I divide it and pieces sit there. Now, the Israelites, being that they would have been cooking over an open fire, they would have left the dough in their kneading trough, broken off a piece, flattened it out, slapped it on their cooking surface. Grabbed another piece. It's not in a constant state of motion. I also know that if you knead a bread longer than necessary, it becomes very tough. It won't flatten out as well as early on, just after you have kneaded the dough. And that has nothing to do with the yeast content in the dough at all. It has to do with the gluten being released. And the more you release, the more that you knead a dough, the tougher it becomes. But according to rabbis, you must keep your dough in a constant state of motion. It needs to continue to be kneaded right until it's formed and then sent into that extremely hot oven. According to rabbis, this only takes 18 minutes to accomplish. Now, there are plenty of videos out there of sisters in faith who have taken the time to put together videos showing you how you too can make unleavened bread in 18 minutes or less. And I'm sure you could. But that's not the point of my video series. My video series is based on what did they do in the Exodus, remembering that we are not to add to or take away from the Word of God. So, adding an 18-minute rule is adding to the Word of God. They would not have done that. In addition to that, I want to bring up where they went. They left Goshen, and they took with them a dough ball. And that dough ball was wrapped in cloth. And when they got to Sukkoth, they made bread. That was a long walk. Now, somewhere along the way, I am sure that they would have eaten unleavened bread because it could have taken up to 4.5 days for them to walk that far. Scripturally speaking, it does not say, and I am only asking the question, did they bake enough bread to take with them to eat on the trip? Did they stop as they went along and baked bread quickly? It does not say. I pray one day we will learn and find out. But I want the burden to be light. I want the yoke to be easy. That is what Yeshua said his word is. That is what his doctrines are. That is what his truth is. As simple as that. So what do we do? Go watch my demonstration video. Make it easier on yourself. You don't have to comply with an 18-minute rule. And you also do not have to only eat those hard crackers. There are so many other varieties, wonderful varieties. There's naan bread. There is simple flatbreads. There are tortillas you can make. You can even buy some of these without yeast content. The point is, God told us to remember very simply what is written in the scriptures. He wants us to remember how they left in haste, how they were protected as they left, how he provided for them as they left. They took with them the wealth of Egypt, and they ate unleavened bread so they would always remember God is their provider, God is their protector. And we need to remember that in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As we go through this series, I promise we will also discuss what you see in the unleavened bread and in the feast of Yeshua and how it points to him in our lives, because we always need to remember what he did during that time of year. Honor the Exodus, but it points to Christ. It points to Yeshua. And because it points to Yeshua, we have to also remember what he did during that same 7-day period. What he did for us. Now, I'm going to be blunt as far as the rabbinic rules. You should not be following rabbinic rules. They're not biblical. Somebody's going to argue with me, and I know they will. However, I'm going to point something out here to you. Remember those times on groups or when you were talking with other sisters in faith about cherry picking pieces of the Bible that they want to follow and not follow? Have you ever heard the term cafeteria Christians or cafeteria Bible study where you pick and choose? It's like going to a smorgasbord dinner. Aren't you doing the same? How many of us have judged those Christians or even other Torah observant people for cherry picking while we ourselves are doing the same? It's so simple what God wrote in the Bible about the Exodus. Let's not cherry pick. Let's not add to or take away from the Word of God. Let's follow what He says. And the words are simple. I invited you to watch the instruction video that I shared. So as a conclusion, I want to show you something and demonstrate something here. I am one woman. If I were married to one man and I had a handful of children, let's just pick a number. I'm one woman and I'm leaving Egypt with the Israelites, and I have to make a batch of pitas, flatbreads for 8 people. It's going to take me at least 1 minute to measure out my ingredients in a bowl. Even if it just is me grabbing a handful or 2 of flour because I know how much I'm going to put in my bowl and then adding in the water, it's still going to be 1 minute to gather my ingredients and measure them out. Then once I get them in the bowl, I need to start working the dough. That's going to be a minimum of 3 minutes because I timed myself. It's a minimum of 3 minutes to mix the ingredients together. Then you have to knead the dough because dough needs to be kneaded, whether you're using a white flour all-purpose or whether you're using a whole grain product. You need to knead. Kneading for my particular type of grain is 6 to 8 minutes by hand. It's 5 minutes in my mixer, but you know they didn't have a KitchenAid when they left Egypt. So we are already up to a minimum of 10 minutes. Shocked? Okay. Now you have to divide it, roll it. And a more flexible dough will be real easy to roll. It'll take 30 seconds or less to pat out 1 piece of bread. So a total already 11 minutes. Now you have to cook it. It takes about 2 minutes on each side, depending on how hot your rock or your cooking dome would be at that time. 1 at a time, that will take you at least, I said 8, at least 16 minutes. That's if I cook each individual pita by hand or, individually. Now, what if I can miraculously cook all of my pita at the same time? A minimum of 8. That's 1 plus 3 plus 6 plus 5 plus only 3 minutes to cook all of them at once. That's a bare minimum. That in and of itself will simply add up to about 18 minutes. And that way you might make it. But you're going to have a surface large enough to cook all of those pita at one time. All of those flatbreads. Now imagine if you're taking care of a large family because you have your grandparents there, or your parents there, your adult children, and their families. What are you going to do if you have to make 50 or 60 in 18 minutes? I challenge you to try. Blessings and shalom.